European leaders are gathering in Brussels to discuss protective measures in response to potential trade barriers. While Canada and Mexico are already facing economic pressure from Washington, the European Union is also preparing for similar tariffs, especially after Donald Trump described the EU as, quote, an atrocity. This will inevitably happen to the European Federation, and I guarantee you that, Trump stated. They have been taking advantage of us for a long time. We have a trade deficit of over $300 million. They don't buy our cars, they don't take our products, they take almost nothing from us. Meanwhile, we take everything from them. The European Federation is acting aggressively. In response, European politicians, including Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, emphasized that they are not responsible for the potential escalation of trade conflicts between the EU and the US. We have extensive economic ties, and we need cooperation with America just as much as America needs cooperation with us. Imposing tariffs will only increase costs, Kallas stressed. Our correspondent, Lucia Schoten, is reporting from Brussels, where the summit is taking place. Lucia, what are European leaders saying about the potential tariffs? Most of the delegates attending the meeting have unanimously expressed the view that such measures could harm both the European and American economies. The prevailing sentiment here is strong opposition to this initiative, the correspondent reports. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz pointed out that introducing harsh trade measures is a poor decision for both the EU and the US. European leaders took this moment to highlight the strength of their union. The Prime Minister of Luxembourg stated that the EU is as powerful as the US and is ready to defend its interests. At the same time, Brussels is seeking dialogue. But if no compromise is found, the European Commission will take countermeasures. The Commission has already indicated that it is prepared to respond but sees this as a last resort. Which industries could be affected? It all depends on the nature of the tariffs, but the most likely sectors to be hit are those where the EU actively exports to the US, automobiles and the chemical industry. Companies in these fields are closely monitoring the situation. As an alternative, the EU could increase purchases of American LNG, boost defense spending, or enhance financial cooperation. Currently, EU countries spend 2% of their GDP on defense, but Trump has proposed raising it to 5%. If escalation cannot be avoided, the EU will likely impose retaliatory sanctions. This has happened before. During Trump's first administration, Brussels introduced tariffs on bourbon, orange juice, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and other goods. It is likely that the EU will adopt a similar strategy this time. With a high probability, the European Union will take countermeasures, once again targeting the same categories of goods. However, a key question remains. Can all 27 EU countries act in unison, find common ground, and function as a united bloc? Or will the Trump administration apply pressure on individual countries, aiming to weaken the Union's unity? It's important to consider that trade relations between the EU and the US are extensive. The EU exports more to America than it imports. In fact, the US market is the largest destination for European exports. Approximately 1.5% of all goods produced in Europe are sent across the Atlantic. The key exports include pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, and automobiles. However, Europe is also significantly dependent on imports from the US, particularly in oil, gas, and pharmaceuticals. Different EU countries will experience the impact of a trade conflict in different ways. For instance, countries with strong pharmaceutical and chemical industries, such as Belgium and Ireland, as well as those with a developed automotive and machinery sector, like Germany and Slovakia, could face the greatest risks. Already the market is reacting with concern to potential escalation. How will a severe deterioration in trade relations between the EU and the US affect the global economy? This question remains open, but significant consequences are inevitable. A full-scale escalation of trade conflicts could lead to catastrophic consequences, affecting not only the US and the European Union, but also their closest allies, Canada and Mexico. Moreover, such a crisis could extend to other countries, including China, as well as BRICS nations and many other global economies. If global trade networks were to collapse, it would inevitably impact global GDP, pushing several economies into recession. The world would stand on the brink of a major economic reshuffling, where the strongest players would begin fighting for dominance. You mentioned that the European Union must demonstrate unity against potential US trade restrictions. However, there is also a risk that Trump may attempt to weaken individual European states selectively. Which countries could be targeted, and in which sectors. One of the most vulnerable industries is automobile manufacturing. Germany, as a leading exporter of cars to the US, would be among the first affected. Even though many German car manufacturers have already established production facilities in Mexico and the US itself, restrictions could still impact the export market. If Trump decides to strike this sector, the consequences for Europe's largest economies will be severe. It is crucial to remember that not all EU countries are major car manufacturers, which raises an important question. Will European states be able to act together and recognize that this is not just about prices, but about a broader threat to the European Union as a whole? If each nation defends only its own interests, a unified European approach could be at risk. This conflict could turn into a full-fledged economic battle, with Trump selecting individual targets and using economic sanctions against them to fracture EU unity. During Trump's first administration, the European market faced a similar challenge when Washington imposed tariffs on European steel and aluminum. Can any lessons be learned from that experience? The key takeaway seems to be that unity and coordination are essential. Initially, European countries responded individually, but they eventually reached a unified stance, and the tariffs were partially revised. In March, the EU is expected to review its trade policy once again. This demonstrates that if Europe manages to maintain unity, it can stand up to pressure from the US. However, much depends on Trump's intentions and future actions. How aggressive will his trade policy be? How will the European Union respond? These questions remain unanswered, and the coming months will be crucial in this economic standoff. Perhaps the world is entering a new era of global realignment, where the main weapon is no longer military technology, but economic pressure, trade wars, and sanctions.